Welcome to the first module of the Introduction to Digital Identities series. My name is Alexandre Amard, and I'm a researcher at the SNT, the Interdisciplinary Center for Security, Reliability and Trust at the University of Luxembourg, where I study the impact of digital technologies on the interaction between governments and citizens. I'm also a consultant for the public and private sector, helping them make sense of the fast pace of innovation in digital technologies and how to apply them in a meaningful and secure way. Today, our topic will be digital identity. We will be looking at it from a socio-technical perspective. The objective of this primer is to provide you with the main elements to comprehend identity in the context of transactions and how our shift from a physical to a digital world impacts it. Throughout this presentation, I will be giving you a sense of why digital identity is important in today's and tomorrow's world. Let us start with 4 basic questions to kick off our topic. 1. Who are you? 2. How do you prove it? 3. How can we facilitate desirable identity transactions? And 4. How can we prevent undesirable ones? Any ideas? Great! We will see more about that in the next couple of minutes. You probably noticed it. During the past years, we have been consistently more and more online. This effect was only accelerated by the COVID-19 pandemic, a movement towards an exponentially increasing number of digital interactions and transactions. Having to prove your identity to access an online service is becoming so frequent and prevalent for a variety of use cases that we don't even notice when we're doing it anymore. Long gone are the days of having one password to access a few websites. We now must formally identify ourselves to a multitude of services, including governmental ones, on a daily basis. And for this, we have to use a digital representation of our identity and credentials. Several countries have been rolling out digital identities to their citizens in the past decade, one of the most prominent examples being India. The Aadhaar system contains identity data of more than 1.3 billion Indian citizens and residents, enabling them to access governmental services without a physical proof of identity. But as with any societal change, come challenges. On the personal level, identity theft is becoming a major issue, and it has become the #1 type of fraud in the United States. Still on the personal level, the risk of being targeted because of specific identity attributes such as religion, ethnic origin, or political affiliation grows as citizen identity attributes are easily available to malevolent actors. On the societal scale, we have seen that major technology actors piling up identity data can lead to misuse, for example, influencing the recent elections in the UK and the USA. So, on the one side, digital identity will increasingly become unavoidable to participate in our digital society and economy. And on the other, there are inherent risks associated to its propagation and wide use. But for now, let's go back to the first question we asked in the lecture. What comes to your mind if I'm asking you, who are you? Most likely, you're instinctively thought of your name. And the name is indeed the most common aspect that people identify themselves with. Your name, like other characteristics pertaining to your identity, can be called an identity attribute. That is, an element that, in conjunction with other attributes, composes your identity. However, your name is most likely not unique. What if your name is James Smith, Maria Garcia, Zhang Wei, or Mohammed Khan, for example? Your name alone would not be enough to distinguish you from others with the same name. So in many cases, we have to use more attributes in order to identify ourselves. Your place and date of birth are attributes that are typically used in administration-related processes. When combined with the name, these attributes have a higher chance of being a unique set of identity attributes that can unambiguously identify a person. But in some cases, this information is not known to the entity you want to identify yourself to. In a professional context, except with your human resources department, you are unlikely to be successfully identified thanks to these attributes. Contextual attributes come into play in those cases, such as a particular activity you perform or responsibility you have, such as your professional position or associative engagement. Linking one's identity to the identity of their relatives is also a common way to disambiguate. The Greeks were particularly inclined to use the name of the parents or spouse as a way to identify someone. If I was speaking about Alexander, son of Philip, you would likely to identify this Alexander as Alexander the Great. Speaking of Alexander the Great, you will recognize that nicknames can also play an important role in specific contexts. Depending on your interest, you might easily know who Sleepy Joe, Plato, or Madonna refer to. Alexander the Great was also called Alexander of Macedon, which refers to the birthplace. Another example of identity attributes are biometrics. Biometrics are physical or personal behavioral traits that can be used to identify individuals. DNA and fingerprints surely come to your mind, but height and eye color, attributes that are on many identity cards today, are also part of this category. Now, as we mentioned earlier, some, if not all, identity attributes can also be used in a malevolent way to target people with specific attributes. Ethnic origin, religion, and sexual orientation are just examples of attributes that might be used to target someone. As a side note, these categories I just mentioned are all part of what the European General Data Protection Regulation calls sensitive data. This makes their processing prohibited by default unless an exception applies, and they must be protected with a higher level of security than other types of personal data. But your identity is more than these attributes, and you can even have different identities. For example, we create and use identities on a daily basis when we interact with online service providers, such as social media or e-commerce platforms. You will inevitably generate an identity for these service providers, and there will likely be a substantial difference between it and the elements we mentioned earlier. This is when we must make the difference between foundational identity and contextual identity. Can you guess what that difference is? That's right. Foundational identity comprises core elements of your identity that are the result of what we call foundational events, such as birth, name, immigration, and so on. These elements are typically collected and certified by a public sector organization and often recorded in civil registration and vital statistics databases. These foundational attributes change rarely, if ever, and are for the most part applicable in any context. Contextual identity, on the other side, comprises attributes that depend on the context in which they are used. Here, imagination is the limit. We can mention, for example, a specific role in an association, such as president of a sports club, or possessing a driver's license of a specific country. In context, they're very useful, but out of it, their value dramatically drops for the purpose of identifying you. In most cases, when asked to disclose our identity, we present a credential. This can be an identity card, a passport, a driver's license. These credentials allow service providers, which from an identity-related transaction standpoint we call a relying party, to identify a person. The reason it works is because this relying party knows that they can trust whoever issued this credential, in most cases, the state. This trust is not a given. The fact that the credentials I just mentioned are widely accepted is due to a heavy standardization effort by international bodies and an impressive organization to agree on processes and governance arrangements to make it work. Credentials can also be vaccination certificates, or diplomas, or many other things. While credentials are not part of someone's identity, they are still very much essential to represent this identity in transactional processes. In many cases, contextual credentials can only be obtained following presentation of credentials containing certified foundational identity attributes, such as name and date of birth. For example, to obtain a driver's license, a company badge, a student card, a credential such as an ID card or passport is most certainly requested. In the same way, in order to be accepted at a university program, an education credential in the form of a degree certificate is needed. This highlights a key role for credentials. Having a good way of sharing them and trusting them is essential. But this is easier said than done. Credentials come in all manners of shapes and forms, ranging from purely physical to purely digital, with physical credentials increasingly possessing a digital component to enhance their security. What kind of security? For the purpose of this introduction, we will speak about the main processes that require a particular attention in order to have trust in identity transaction. The first one is identification. Identification is the process by which you claim an identity. When someone looks you up in a list, for example, when you're voting, you are identifying yourself. At this stage, your identity claim is just that, a claim. I could, for example, say that I'm Nelson Mandela, but that wouldn't make it true. The second is authentication. Authentication is the means by which you prove your identity claim, demonstrating that indeed you are the person who is the owner of the identity you just claimed. There are many authentication modalities, which typically include biometric features, password, or PINs, a one-time password received on your mobile phone, and many more. Finally comes enrollment, which is the process during which your identity is registered with a service provider. To enroll, you first need to identify yourself and then prove your identity. Credentials can play a key role for all these processes. They act as proof of identity and of identity attributes, and usually contain elements that can show that I'm indeed the rightful holder of that credential, such as a photo of myself, my height, and so on. But do we always need to be identified with certainty in the digital world? How can we share credentials in the digital world, and how do we safeguard privacy while doing so? These are questions we will answer in the next episode of this series. Before we close this introductory episode, let us recap what we just learned. 1. We have many different identity attributes that can be used to identify ourselves. 2. We can make different combinations thereof to identify ourselves in different contexts. 3. Some, if not all, of our identity attributes come with an attached risk of targeting. 4. Credentials can act as representations of our attributes. And 5. There are different ways we can secure an identity transaction. I hope this first episode covering the basics of identity was helpful to you. In the next episode, we will be talking about the critical question of balancing security and user-friendliness, control and exposure over identity data, to keep our identities safe in the digital world. Thank you for watching, and stay tuned.